So let me start with the first question. Do you see the European Union too optimistic in their new action plan to make the EU climate neutral until 2050? And what are the main challenges and possibilities?
First and foremost, I think it's important to say that there is no optimistic or pessimistic way to make policies for tackling climate change. There is only the necessary, and that is not necessary. It's only what we have to do to achieve the goal, and that is what was decided in Paris. That is what we agreed on to limit ourselves to a 1.5 degrees climate change limits, and that is what should determine our policies. And this is where the Green Deal steps in. I don't think it's optimistic, it's just what is necessary to do. And the willingness of the European Union is one thing. The other thing is, how are our allies dealing with this in the world? Because obviously it's a global challenge. And if only the European Union is stepping up, we won't get anywhere. But then again, I think that's the changes that have happened in politics in the United States is something that is really making this thing look up, I guess. It's the achieving this on a global scale has gotten a lot more realistic in the past couple of months. But it has become also clear to Europe that this is actually a market opportunity for us. It's a way to really redefine the economic future in the next couple of decades for the European Union, to see the greening of our markets, of our economies, as a real possibility for a lot more innovation happening in Europe, a lot more entrepreneurship happening in Europe, and to really redefine the way that we work for people and with people.
Mm-hmm. In a press statement of the NEOS party, you said, and I quote, "It is time for courageous politics." Are most of the EU members ready for such courageous politics? And how do you define courageous politics?
What we mean by courageous politics is to have this as a principle in politics. And I guess it's also very much a principle of liberal politics. It's doing what is necessary and doing what's right, and not just what is popular with people, with citizens, or with voters. And for me, courageous politics, even though you wouldn't probably say that that is the definition of courageous, is also doing what you think is necessary to have a better future. And it is certainly true, especially for European politics, that for the most part, you would know what you have to do in order for the European way of life to prevail in the future, in order to prevent that all of Europe would at some point in the near future just be a really nice outdoor museum for people to visit from all over the world. There are certain things that we need to change, but for that, you would have to explain to people that politics is not just about the short term. Better politics are about the long term. And that is what courageous policies are about. And we need that, especially in the European Union, because making changes and making reforms in the European Union is very much about the really long term.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the willingness of EU citizens, especially in talking about courageous politics, to adapt their way of life to achieve the goals of the EU action plan? And especially, what is the role of the youth, the Fridays for Future protests and demonstrations, which are still going on also in times of pandemics?
Well, going back to the last question, what young people are showing is that they have a willingness to plan forward, especially the Fridays for Future activists have a really long-term goal. It's about preventing a catastrophe that even we might, in our lifetime, we might not yet see in the full scale if nothing is done. But it will be very relevant for future generations. So that is also a definition of the willingness to be courageous, to think forward and think about the future in ways that others cannot or aren't willing to do. Young people are also a lot more pro-European than older generations, because they haven't seen anything else in their lifetime, and they are not willing to imagine a life without Europe and a life without the European Union. I think generally what citizens want, and I totally understand that, is not, they don't think, or actually nobody does that. No normal person thinks in institutions or constitutional reform or whatever. That's also not their job. That is the job of politicians. What people want is that the European Union and their national states work for them. And it's our job to explain what is necessary to change in order for the union to work for its people.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see Austria in the European Green Deal action plan? What is the role of Austria, and how does it have a good starting position in terms of how it developed in terms of green energy and green development?
Well, we have set a very ambitious goal in Austria when it comes to, especially to the energy transition. But I think in the execution, we will see that it's not as easy as we think. Austria, actually, when it comes to green energy, has a rather privileged starting point because of the hydropower that is available in an alpine country. Other countries do not have that privilege and have really different strategies on how to green their energy sector. We will see how it turns out when it comes to the really tough projects like greening our CO2 heavy industries. When you think of steel, for example, steel plants are the largest contributors to CO2 emissions in Austria. And that will be a really big challenge to change that industry for the better. That is obviously a relevant question for the entire European Union, but I think it's also relevant for Austria because we will have to see, even though we had a great starting point, it will be even tougher to change those things that are still left up in the open. And it's also a question of how can you make it easier for everyday people to change something in their lives. It's about providing infrastructure for green transport, for green mobility. It's about providing infrastructure to green the building sector, for example. And there we will need to have a lot more change and not just PR. Many things in green politics all across the world, but especially also in Europe right now, is very often greenwashing in some sense, because the changes that have to be done are systematic in nature. And that obviously is harder to make than something that just can be easily changed.
Mm-hmm. Having in mind that all EU member states are legally bound to the European Green Deal through the European Climate Law, how can the EU react to potential failure of member states to meet the expectations of the plan? Do you see a possibility of using sanctions effectively in this case?
Well, we have agreed on binding targets. And I think what we need to focus right now is not already talking about what will happen if some don't meet those binding targets, but that we really provide and really focus on providing the instruments that member states need to achieve these goals. And as I said before, the starting point for many countries is really different. If you look at the energy sector and industry in Poland, for example, they won't be able to change that with hydropower. They're not in a position to do that. So we need to help, especially those countries that have larger changes to go through in order to achieve them. Because we're all in the same boat, it is relevant for the entire European Union. It's not just people's jobs there in those countries where they live. So it's about providing help, providing also frameworks in regulation relevant to energy, to the industry sector, to new technologies that you want to use. It's also about providing funds. That is what the Just Transition Fund will be about, to really make it fair to everybody, especially those that will have to do more than others. And it's also about providing transparency. And this brings us to the topic also of some kind of CO2 pricing, be it by changing the emissions trading system to expand it to other sectors or have a different system altogether. This is about transparency so that we really see where the emissions come from.
Mm-hmm. COVID-19 has struck the whole of the world, not only the European Union and the European countries, but the whole of the world. What do you think? How can EU member states cooperate and coordinate in global crises? What can we learn from this COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the European Union, considering the green future and this European Green Deal?
The COVID pandemic for the European Union has acted as a kind of institutional stress test for all the institutions, not just for example, for the Commission or for the Parliament alone, but especially in terms of how we interact also with member states, with governments, and how can we coordinate. It has shown the weaknesses of the European Union, especially when it comes to voluntary solidarity, for example. Early on in the beginning, there was a lot of talk about where is the European Union in this crisis, even though we were talking about a field of politics, health, where the European Union only has a very, very restricted competence in legislation. Now, when we move towards vaccination, you really see the power of the institutions and how they work and whether or not they are up to the challenge of being really flexible, moving really fast, and providing what people need right now. When you look at the ECDC or also the European Medicines Agency. I believe that the most important thing that we can learn from it is to learn from it. So the worst thing will be if nothing changes after the crisis. We really need to look very honestly about what worked and what didn't work in order to make it better for the future.
And can you tell from your experience where the European Union can act better, especially considering the COVID-19 pandemic and maybe also the distributions of the vaccines? So especially something from that.
Well, it's one of the examples where the entire decision-making process is rather dysfunctional, because early on you say, we're doing it together, but you still need to get all 27 member states on board for every major decision that you want to make. And you see that there are different goals countering each other. You either have everybody being able to provide their opinion in every step of the way, or you have flexibility and speed on the other hand. And we need to find a better balance for the future. And that, of course, has to do, once again, with the decision-making processes that are, as I said before, the main hurdle for the European structure to really function better.
Okay, thank you very much for this interview, especially for the first 3 questions and for this short in-depth discussion that we had. Thank you very much.